The US EPA, as one example, defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to, or in the context of, development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. Now, although this definition is US specific, and there are many considerations that apply in the US that might not apply necessarily elsewhere, overall, the idea is the correct one in terms of fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And meaningful involvement particularly, of course, relates to issues of public participation. When we think about environmental justice in ASEAN, we see that a number of regional institutions, and in particular, I'm referring here to the Asian Development Bank and the UN Environment Programme, that these institutions have been working for some years with a range of people, judges, academics, government officials, to further the cause of environmental justice through conferences, meetings, roundtables, and other forms of capacity building. But in the last few years, these initiatives have particularly included a consideration of environmental human rights. One of the things that I would want to argue is that when we consider environmental law, we can perceive an implicit right to a quality environment. If that implicit right was not there, what would be the point of environmental law at any of the levels that we're talking about, international, regional, or national? It seems to me that at each of these levels, environmental law, nature conservation, and heritage law harbour the right to a quality environment as an underlying premise. And certainly that right to a quality environment that I'll extrapolate on in a moment is increasingly being recognised as a significant aspect of human rights. We can see this convergence in many multilateral environmental agreements, as well as in statements on human rights. The other aspect, of course, is substantive rights, and this is one that I would want to focus on. The most fundamental of them is, of course, the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. One aspect of this, which I'll look at now, is the question of environmental justice principles, which go to recognize and to promote and implement these substantive and procedural rights. One example is the 2016 IUCN Declaration on the Environmental Rule of Law. Without going into detail, we can see that there are 13 principles that form the central part of the declaration, and they are aimed at promoting and achieving environmental justice through the environmental rule of law. Principle 3 contains the right to environment. Each human, present and future, has the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Of course, there are many ways of formulating this definition, but this is one that is increasingly being accepted. One of the things that we can think about, though, is what quality of environment are we aiming at? And should that differ from one region or country to another, from a city environment to a rural environment? And this is something that we need to think about in terms of classifying the various definitions, as well as the practices at national level in terms of trying to achieve a quality environment. When we go back to 1972, we see that there is already a recognition, but not legally enforceable, of this idea of a right to a good environment, a fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life, in an environment of a quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being. So this is one of the fundamental documents that was put forward already many years ago. But then we see a number of other statements coming out in a range of documents. For example, in 1992, we have Principle 1, placing humans at the center of concerns for sustainable development, entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. But it's not a very strong statement. And one of the questions I would have for you is whether we need a much stronger statement, one that is legally enforceable.